Just 3 weeks from today is Tax Day, the national ritual of accounting for our earnings to the ever-eager Canada Revenue Agency. Most of us will grumble, file, and move on. Others, the so-called Panama Papers revealed this week, send their money to offshore tax shelters, and they grumble less. What's a tax-paying citizen to make of all of this? Well, for a look at the legality and the ethics. In Calgary, Alberta, Lindsay Tedds, professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria and visiting professor at the University of Calgary. And here in studio, Michael Friedman, partner and national coordinator for the tax group at Macmillan LLP. Lindsay, it's good to see you on the program again so soon. And Michael, nice to have you on for the first time here.
Thank you.
Let's just get a kind of what's the overarching thing we learned from the Panama Papers from each of you before we start here. Lindsay, how about from you? The overarching thing that you learned as a result of all of this?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we learned is that from the Panama Papers, we see that the examples coming from Canada are, in fact, fairly boring. There weren't a lot of exciting cases that were leaked, and in fact, other than a small handful, I think the examples have stopped, and I haven't seen anything new.
Michael, what's your big takeaway?
That there is a pervasive development of the use of offshore companies throughout the world, but as Lindsay says, in Canada, the numbers are relatively small. The law firm we were dealing with in Panama had 14,000 client files released, and recent estimates suggest 350 of those may have been Canadians. So a relatively small number, but an interesting glimpse into what's happening on a global basis.
You disappointed to find that out?
No, not disappointed for Canadians.
This seems to, Lindsay, have shocked a lot of people. I mean, the play that this is getting in the media is really quite astonishing. Should it have shocked a lot of people?
I don't think it should have. I mean, we just 2 years ago, or was it, oh no, sorry, it was 3 years ago, we had a release of information about all offshore accounts. And in fact, quite a few of the accounts that we see coming forward in this release were leaked 3 years ago. And out of that, we learned that there's very little cases of pure unadulterated tax evasion going on, and that these are cases of, tax planning. But I think it is starting a bigger and well-needed dialogue about our tax system and how some people are able to use rules to shelter their income from taxes, and how we have in fact selected a few countries which we can put our money in and it can be repatriated literally tax-free.
Here is a statement that the law firm in Panama in question put out to respond to this controversy, let's just call it that. Our industry is not particularly well understood by the public, and unfortunately this series of articles will only serve to deepen that confusion. The facts are these: while we may have been the victim of a data breach, nothing we've seen in this illegally obtained cache of documents suggests we've done anything illegal, and that's very much in keeping with the global reputation we've built over the past 40 years of doing business the right way, right here in Panama. Michael, let's help the public understand this a little bit better. The law firm in question here, Mossack Fonseca, what do they do?
Well, they are a law firm that forms offshore entities. In the Panama Papers, they suggested that over the course of 40 years, they've formed about 215,000 offshore entities for taxpayers. Many of those were probably for legitimate purposes, for businesses conducting operations abroad. For others, and we're seeing news stories, perhaps they were used for purposes other than legitimate commercial planning to hide assets or otherwise.
And again, lots of jargon that we've heard during the course of all this, but what's a shell company? We hear this all the time.
It's relatively simple, and people seem to imagine that it is more than it is. It's simply a company formed offshore under a foreign law with a particular shareholder. It usually has a numbered company name or some nondescript name, and the shareholders are not immediately apparent from just looking at the company. So it's an intermediary.
And the point of setting it up is what?
There can be legitimate points, so you would carry on business through that entity, or for those that are stacking companies or are cycling companies, it may be to obscure who's holding an asset or to run funds away from their ultimate source.
What was one of the expressions used there? Stacking a company?
That's right.
What does that mean?
Well, in some cases, what we're learning from the Panama Papers is that someone wouldn't form one offshore company, they'd form 10. One owning another, so it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out who actually is the ultimate beneficial owner.
Okay, Lindsay, we know that there are two different things at play here. We know that there is something called tax evasion and there is something called tax avoidance. Can you help us understand the distinction?
Sure, except for a lot of tax lawyers and tax accountants would want me to use the phrase tax planning rather than tax avoidance. But for an economist, tax avoidance is perfectly fine. But tax evasion is where you are, you're not following the tax rules. You are engaging in illegal behavior. You're not reporting your income, and you're not paying the taxes due on it. Tax planning or tax avoidance is really about organizing your activities to minimize your tax liability, and you're using the letter of the law to be able to do it. Within tax planning and tax avoidance, there's sort of niches here. And one area we need to be very concerned about is aggressive tax planning. These are when you're really bumping right up against the rules, and that maybe in the language of tax law, what you are doing is in fact not adhering to the spirit of the tax legislation, and you could be running afoul of our general anti-avoidance rules.
But to be clear, the tax avoidance or tax planning that you've just described is perfectly legal, yes?
As long as you're following the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, it's perfectly legal.
And Michael, from what you have seen in all of the Panama Papers that have come out so far, are you seeing more tax planning / avoidance or evasion?
Well, I think it's a mixture, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. You can divide groups into two particular columns. One, those that were likely forming and using companies for legitimate purposes. They were engaged in tax planning, nothing illegal with what they were doing. And then there were those, to use Lindsay's terms, that were engaged in tax evasion. They weren't complying with the letter of the law, which oftentimes requires you to report offshore holdings. Instead, they were forming these companies and not reporting them. So two very distinct categories, those abiding by the law and those clearly that were trying to evade it.
Okay, there's that reality, and then there is the reality of politics and optics and public relations and so on, and we needed to get into some discussion about that. Because, Lindsay, we have seen already, obviously, the Prime Minister of Iceland has stepped down. We've seen other corporate executives step down. If it's not illegal, if much of what we're talking about tonight is not illegal, why are so many people so mad about it?
I think they're mad about it. Well, I mean, when you look at what happened in the Icelandic case, for example, here is where his wife had assets which were in an offshore account and which had claims to Icelandic banks, and the Prime Minister was in fact negotiating bailout packages for those banks. So she gained from any of the activities that he did. And so there's a conflict of interest. You know, once you get involved in a political position, you have to be beyond reproach in terms of all of your relationships and your dealings. And the fact of the matter that despite they were in his wife's names, those assets should have been disclosed, and it should have been discussed, and if it was purely legal, then there would be no reason not to disclose it. And then in the case of David Cameron, he acquired benefits from selling shares in an offshore company. And yet for the last 5 or 6 years, he's had very intense rhetoric against such behavior. So I think we have to be, as politicians, you have to be very careful to ensure that your actions are consistent with your words, and that there can't be any sniff of conflict in your business engagements.
No, fair enough, but Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, the Cameron example, the British Prime Minister, all of that happened before he became Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. In which case, are the calls for his resignation and his, being strung up in the town square, are those legitimate?
Well, some would suggest they're not, that in fact if he was complying with the law and reporting as he should, and it was prior to him making those statements, perhaps he shouldn't be held to account to the same standard as if he had made those statements and engaged in the investment activity contemporaneously. The reality, as you said, is politics is a different beast, and that's what's accounted for that.
So there is a morality play at stake here, right? Are there different standards in a morality play than there are for tax lawyers?
Well, I think some people would suggest what is moral when it comes to taxation. Many people would suggest that what morality requires is that you comply with the law, and if you comply with the rules, that's the first and basic measure of morality. Others would suggest that there's a moral duty to pay a certain amount of tax, and that gets into a very gray area. How does each taxpayer determine, once they've complied with the law, what a moral level of compliance would be? Should you not claim a charitable deduction because it would require you to pay less tax? Is that moral or not? It's a difficult debate.
This is a sort of a sliding scale here, Lindsay. Where do you come down on it?
Oh, you know, I've been working in the field of tax noncompliance for a long time. And in the 90s, when I first started doing research on the underground economy and tax noncompliance in Canada, my work was received very skeptically by the government. They were saying that tax noncompliance in Canada is not a problem. There's really no point in anybody researching this. And I sort of see us coming almost 180 with the government now when they see these sorts of details being exposed. Now they're sort of saying that, yes, indeed, tax noncompliance is a problem, and it is probably bigger than we expect. And I'm finally seeing some pressure on CRA to estimate the tax gap, which is something myself and a number of academics, as well as Senator Downs, have been calling on for a number of years. We need to get a handle of this, and the nice part about these sorts of scandals is that it really shines light on an area that requires a lot of public policy attention.
Michael, I guess part of the issue is if very rich people who have access to kind of, people who do what you do, for example, to tax lawyers and to tax loopholes and all legitimate, fair enough, if they are legally taking advantage of all of those things, but other people who make less money don't really have the advantage of taking care of all of those things and therefore have to pay more tax to cover the tax not being paid by these very rich people, would you agree that's a problem?
Well, I think, as Lindsay said, we have to get a handle on what the tax gap actually is. We have a progressive system of taxation in Canada, so those that are earning more pay a higher level of tax. So to simply say that they may be engaging in a transaction that reduces their tax bill, I don't know if that necessarily automatically equates to suggesting that they're not paying the appropriate level of tax. One of the interesting things about the tax gap that Lindsay mentioned is we don't have a sense in relative terms how large it is. There hasn't been enough research or enough analysis to know that. You hear estimates about the tax gap resulting from offshore activity being between $6 and $8 billion, which sounds like a large number.
Sorry, is that for Canada alone?
That's for Canada. Canadian tax revenues as a whole were $300 billion for the upcoming year. So in relative terms, we ask ourselves, what is the significance of that tax gap and how do we measure it? So we really are in early days to try and understand how significant a problem this actually is.
Lindsay, does your research point to a tax gap of potentially $6 to $8 billion annually?
Well, when I look at the tax noncompliance writ large. I don't just focus in on tax havens and offshore accounts. When we are looking at it, and there's a number of researchers applying different data and different methods, the estimates that we come up with in terms of the amount of income that is unreported for tax purposes, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And we're looking at a potential tax gap of about $30 billion. And those estimates actually accord with the tax gap information that's coming out of the U.S. In the U.S., they estimate their tax gap to be over $300 billion. And usually we sort of look at Canada as being about 10% of whatever Americans do. So $30 billion is not that much to be thinking about. But how much of that is offshore? That's minimal. Most of this is going to be domestic tax evasion.
Edward Snowden, whom I think everybody knows, who's made headlines constantly over the last couple of years, tweeted the following. He said, with scandals in Russia, China, UK, Iceland, Ukraine, and more, perhaps a new rule. If you're in charge of a country, keep your money in it. Michael, good advice?
From a political perspective, perhaps that is good advice.
How about from a tax planning perspective?
Well, a tax planning perspective, again, it comes down to the point of what is the rule of law and what should we be allowing people to do.
Lindsay, from a moral perspective, if you're leading a country, keep your money in it?
Well, I certainly think we remember back in the days when Paul Martin was finance minister and he was facing increasing pressure about his operation of his steamship lines that was incorporated down in Barbados. And yes, I do believe that once you enter into political life, you have to be thinking very carefully about how you've structured your business and what that means for the country and the policies that you are putting in place.
So help us with this. Give us your opinion on this, Lindsay. If people have, worked hard, been extremely successful, made a great deal of money operating under the laws of any particular country, let's say Canada, where they enjoy, for lack of a better expression, free health care, free education. Of course, we pay for it through our taxes, but essentially, humor me with that argument for a second. Sure. Do you think they should be obligated to pay in tax whatever the government demands?
I think they should be obligated to pay the tax that our tax code tells them they can pay. So when we start seeing these cases where people are perhaps being able to avoid paying what, quote unquote, we call their fair share, I have a problem with that. But when we start thinking about people not being able to contribute to the services that they are consuming, then what we need to do, and a number of us have been calling for this, is we need to look at our tax system and we need to think about tax reform. Our tax system was last reformed in like 1966. The economy has changed, income has changed, the world has changed, and it is time to scrap what we have and start all over again and form a tax system that represents the current situation that we're facing as well as looking forward to the future.
Michael, one does hear calls for a corporate minimum tax because if you're smart enough to be able to organize your affairs in such a way that you pay absolutely no tax at all, yet you enjoy all of these services, to a lot of people that will seem unfair. What's your view on that?
I think the corporate tax is misunderstood in one sense. Again, there's this conception that it bears a significant portion of our total tax revenue. That's simply not true. Mm-hmm. It's under 15% of total tax revenue. It also needs to be borne in mind that corporations employ capital, and if you increase taxation on corporations, they can pass that on to consumers in terms of higher prices. So it sometimes is a little simplistic to suggest that you simply have to tax corporations more. Instead, we have to think about what is the appropriate level of tax and how does that actually bear through the economy. If we simply increased corporate tax rates by 15%, would that lead to a loss of positions? Would it lead to that tax burden being passed on to individuals? So it's not as simplistic or simple as simply increasing taxes. We have to think about how do we spread that tax burden and how do we want to provide incentives to businesses to actually set up in Canada. Canada right now has among the lower corporate tax rates in the industrialized world, and that was by design to try and attract businesses to Canada and to create jobs. So before we start quarreling with that or troubling that balance, we have to think about what the ultimate implications will be.
Okay, in our last couple of minutes here, let's focus in on this. Lindsay, in your view, should governments around the world be trying to crack down on the tax havens that these Panama Papers have revealed?
Well, we have in fact been making great strides in the last 15 years in terms of opening up our tax treaties as well as tax sharing agreements with a number of tax havens. And so as a result, the number of them have actually been reduced. We still have a few tax holdouts. Panama would be one of them. And I think now we're starting to see, especially out of Panama, increasing pressure to reform the system. So I think governments have made great strides. I think that they need to do more. But we're now at a point where we're pitting governments against governments. And, you know, we don't really like it when the Americans start telling us what kind of policies we need to have in place. And so we need to be cautious about how we treat other governments as well.
Michael, your view on whether government should crack down on these tax havens?
I think they already are. Lindsay mentioned the tax information exchange agreements. We have a broad set of agreements with countries that were traditionally called tax havens. We're now monitoring electronic fund transfers of over $10,000. The government just reported that they are receiving information on about 1 million transactions per month, so they do have that information. And they're also encouraging and taking steps to motivate voluntary compliance. The number of voluntary disclosures made for offshore accounts has skyrocketed. It went up over 150% last year alone. So people are taking notice of the government's actions and are actually coming forward in greater numbers to disclose voluntarily.
Lindsay, let me put this one to you. The Canada Revenue Agency has released a statement saying that it's pursuing cooperation from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to get all of the leaked data as it relates to Canadians. Given that this information was, you could make an argument that this information was illegally obtained. Is it fair for the CRA to use this information in its work?
The CRA has, full ability to use whatever information it can get its hands on. There is a lot of pressure on CRA to get their hands on these papers and to follow up and make sure that all of these accounts were disclosed. I guess whether or not they should be using, we don't even know exactly how this data was acquired. We don't know how it was disseminated. We don't know how the person got it. So it's hard to say whether or not, it's wrong wrong of CRA to use it when, in fact, CRA is facing increasing pressure to ensure that it is following up on these papers. I think they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Michael, have you got a view on whether or not CRA should be allowed to use this information, particularly if it was illegally obtained?
It is very tricky because you don't want a revenue authority, a government agency, going out and trying to solicit information that was gotten illegally. And they've faced this pressure for quite some time. People are quite familiar with their offshore tax informant program, where they've decided to start offering rewards for people to provide information about other taxpayers' non-compliance. They made a very conscious decision to say that program will only apply to information relating to offshore holdings, because they were concerned about taxpayers domestically going out and trying to obtain information about others. So as Lindsay says, this is a debate that's raging within the CRA. They have to try and figure out, how do we balance the need to obtain this information from having to deal with situations where it's obtained illegally or improperly.
Gotcha. I think we all understand this a lot better now, thanks to you two. So thanks to Lindsay Tedds, joining us on the line from the University of Calgary, and Michael Friedman, the National Practice Group Leader for Tax Practice at Macmillan LLP. Thanks to both of you for being on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.